So now comes the time to talk about maybe the things I don't like about the remaster. And you know what? There actually isn't a lot. And maybe it's just because I'm a Pathfinder channel and I happen to really like Pathfinder Second Edition and a lot of things in the remaster, but I don't have a lot of things that are just like, ooh, Paizo, what did you do? However, there are some things that I think either maybe through ambiguity existed before or new wording added some ambiguity. So there are some specific things I'd like to talk about, some clarifications that I just don't like, as well as just the general pace of the remaster being kind of introduced and released. But let's go ahead and talk about these things. So my name is Don. I'm trying to be the Sly Strategist, and let's go ahead and get into it. So, if you happen to see my prior video, probably one of the first things that I don't particularly like is that they cleared up some ambiguity on death and dying rules and what exactly happens in a recovery check. And I do feel it makes the game a lot deadlier. It makes keeping a hero point around so you don't get into the wounded condition or can come back up quickly very important, as well as certain feats that might have been considered trap feats now make a lot of sense. But the big thing to kind of show what the difference is once you get to the old second edition Death and Dying rules and the new remaster getting knocked out recovery check death and dying rules. The big difference is really in the recovery checks, and it is in the failure and critical failure. So let's take a look at those really quickly. In the recovery checks, it used to read your dying value increases by 1 on a failure and your dying value increases by 2 on a critical failure. Now it's your dying value increases by 1 plus your wounded value, if any. And on a critical failure, your dying value increases by 2 plus your wounded value, if any. Now, I do have a whole nother video about this, and it basically comes down to this whole taking damage while dying. It used to read, if you have the wounded condition, remember to add the value of your wounded condition to your dying value. And it says that in the new one as well here. But it is this clarification in the recovery checks to where you have to add your wounded value anytime you fail a recovery check that is going to make it a lot more deadly. I am still kind of at odds as to which way I'll play it, but I'm kind of leaning more and more towards playing it as written and see how that goes. But, as they say kind of at the beginning of all these books, the game is ours, the game is yours, so you can play it how you would like to play it. Now, they did clarify some ambiguity by introducing some new verbiage in the remaster. However, there was also some introduced in a bunch of different places. And, I could go into some of the big ones like the spell school thing, but that's a really large topic. So let's take it down to a very single spell to talk about how removing something that in truth I think is a generally good idea, and that would be removing spell components can introduce some need for clarification and searching for information. So to kind of give a little background to this, I had a comment come in and it was basically saying, well, what happens if your spellcaster is tied up? Can they still cast a spell now? Well, my immediate thought was somatic. No, they can't. But remember, spell components aren't around anymore. So let's go ahead and take a look at somatic. A somatic component is a specific hand movement or gesture that generates a magical nexus. The spell gains the manipulate trait and requires you to make gestures. You can use this component while holding something in your hand. Cool, but not if you are restrained or otherwise unable to gesture freely. There's more to it, spells that require you to touch the target, and so on and so forth. But it is that, but not if you are restrained or otherwise unable to gesture freely. That eliminates a lot of spells because you are restrained, tied up. However, with the removal of spell components, that's not exactly the case. So let's take a look at a spell from second edition pre-remaster, as well as the same exact spell in the post-remaster, and I'm going to go with Bane. So Bane, spell level 1, it had the enchantment and mental traits, traditions divine, occult, casting, somatic, and verbal. You did have those components as part of it with somatic and verbal. Area 5-foot emanation, saving throw, will, duration is 1 minute. Let's look at that exact spell in player core. In player core, Bane, 2 actions, spell level 1, Concentrate, manipulate, and mental traits. Tradition's divine, area 10-foot emanation, defense is still will, duration still 1 minute. But now you have to look at the specific spell traits. And this one, you have to look at the manipulate. So you have to think about, well, manipulating. So what happens if their hands are tied up? Where would I go? Here's where I went. I looked at manacles. So if you go ahead and bring up manacles, you can now read, you can manacle someone who is willing or otherwise at your mercy as an exploration activity, taking 10 to 30 seconds, depending on the creature's size and how many manacles you apply. A two-legged creature with its legs bound takes a 15-foot circumstance penalty to its speed, and a two-handed creature with its wrists bound has to succeed at a DC 5 flat check anytime it uses a manipulate action or else that action fails. So now, instead of not being able to cast the spell, now if someone, I'm going to say, if you're manacled behind your back, you have to pass a DC 5 flat check. So the answer is now not no, but it's a DC 5 flat check. And then here's the thing. This is one very specific thing I looked up as in something that could restrain your arms. Are there other things that could restrain you? Yes. Now you have to look that up and see how that particular type of restraint binds a manipulate trait in a spell, since it no longer has the simple somatic spell component. So by removing something, which I think is a very good idea, which is spell components, it is going to introduce new ambiguity, new things you need to search for, new things you need to learn. And in truth, I'm excited for it. I love the learning part of it. And I love being able to kind of take each situation one by one and decide how you would like to do it. But now, if someone is manacled, they have to do a DC 5 flat check in order to cast, as opposed to a GM just saying no. At least that's my interpretation. And I will say this, I fully expect someone to come in the comments as soon as I publish this video and say, oh, that's not how it works at all. It would be this. And if they were tied, it would be that. And if they were held, restrained by hand, if someone was just grabbing their hands, then it would be this. I fully expect that to happen, and I expect me to be wrong. This was a 15-minute check in order for me to decide. For manacles, it would be a DC 5 check. Once again, I could be wrong, but it's something that's going to have to take place now because somatic is no longer there. Once again, I agree with it, but it does introduce some variables that didn't exist before. Now, I basically have two other things that I don't particularly like about the remaster, and in the same way, it's kind of more shades of gray than dislike, because you could look at it another way, and I have in my what I like about the books, or what I like about the remaster section, in another light, it's also a positive. So we'll take the first one, and the first one is a pretty easy one. Although I love how the new player core is laid out, and I love how the new GM core is laid out, because they took the information from the player handbook and put it in GM core, now both books are so much easier to read, especially game mastery in general, and being a GM is so much easier to keep track of because everything is in one book. The repetitive stuff, they didn't have to kind of reintroduce, and it all just makes a lot more sense in fewer pages. The downside is you used to be able to buy the player's handbook and GM, and you could handle 98% of the situations, and you could look up the rest on Archives of Nethys. Now you pretty much have to have two books, a player core and a GM core, in order to GM a game. So although I love the new layout, it does require you now to own two books as opposed to one. And then that would be the last thing I don't like about the remaster. And once again, in another light, this is a positive, but by staggering the release of the different core documents, now you kind of are going to have the player core and the GM core, but then you'll have to have the advanced player guide with some things that are overlapping between the two. Plus, you're not getting all the classes in there, and you are going to have extra ancestries, and you're going to have a little bit of extra information here and still have to make some changes in the advanced player's guide. In addition to the bestiary, until Monster Core comes out, you're going to have to make adjustments to the alignments, different damage types, things of that sort. Because everything wasn't released at once, I totally get why they couldn't, and you couldn't expect a company to come out with all those things all at once, unless they would have held up releasing Player Core and GM Core, which I'm glad they didn't. So please don't take this as a Paizo, you're awful, because they aren't. But it is something that's going to have to be said. And then the other thing is that you still are going to have all these other books around, because you are going to have individual spells, individual things that didn't make its way into Player Core that are part of the player's handbook that are still able to be played. So basically, even if you get all the core documents, which is the Player Core 2, GM Core, and Monster Core, it is still going to be super handy to have Archives of Nethys open on your desktop for any searches that you're going to want to do in the future. You do really need to have access to most of the books, or at least Archives of Nethys, at all times in order to kind of keep everything straight for a bit. And that is just kind of the way that when you are iterating to a new update, I don't want to say a new version, but to a new update of a pretty beloved tabletop role-playing system, these are the things that you're going to run into. So once again, I don't blame anybody for it, but the sad truth is that you're going to have to kind of keep track of what's in what books for quite some time until everything comes out. And even after they all come out, there are still going to be things that you're going to have to look at the old books for. Now, that is pretty much the end of what I don't like about the Pathfinder remaster. And it's not very much. And once again, it's not really black and white. There's a lot of gray area there, because a lot of the things that I said are bad, removing material components, is good in other ways, that I like in other ways. The clarification as to every spell requires an incantation and therefore requires speech, or by GM accommodation if you're doing sign language or something along those lines. If you can't do those things, you can't cast it. So by removing spell components, they've also added some good things. So nothing is truly 100% good, nothing is truly 100% bad, but I am overall very happy with the remaster. I enjoy the 2 books that I have a chance to look at. I don't particularly like the new death rules and the new recovery check rules. And having to kind of keep track of multiple books for quite some time is a little bit much, but overall, I'm pretty happy. So I do hope you enjoyed this little summary of the things that I don't really like about the new remaster. Once again, it's not that bad in all truth, but if you did like this video, feel free to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell. But whatever you do, I hope you have a great day and happy adventuring. Thanks.